Warning, the podcast you're about to listen to may contain graphic descriptions of violent acts and injury. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to the Murder Police Podcast, The Murder of Chelsea Hayes, Part 2. Well, David, now that our listeners have listened to Part 1 of the Chelsea Hayes murder, why don't you tell us what they can expect for Part 2?
A lot more details, and there's a lot of details to come, but here's the big thing to listen to this, is to pay attention to how Daniel stayed involved in the lives of the families on both sides of the fence. It's actually amazing, and it's really moving. So with that, let's just jump right back in and get into the interview and finish this case.
I guess I'm just puzzled by this, that if you were, and I know initially he was saying that they just randomly found the girl on the porch, and we know that's not true, but how do you go about just playing a game or even just sitting inside your house if you were to stumble on someone? I think if we were to walk out where we live and find someone on our porch, there would be all kinds of hysteria, and you're screaming and you're freaked out and you're not wanting to get off the phone with dispatch until somebody gets there, because who is this and how in the world did they get there? But to go inside and play a game and everybody's just going on like business as usual, I guess, do they not think that that alone would throw up so many red flags?
It was very unusual, and that's one of the reasons we felt like the suspect was pretty close to what was going on in proximity, because it was just so unusual, the response to what had happened. And to give you some insight to exactly what you're talking about, she had been put on the front porch hours earlier. It wasn't until the suspect's aunt came by to visit that 911 would get called. The suspect's aunt comes by, and the suspect walks out to the car and says, "Hey, Auntie, you have to see this." And she thought he was referring to some pit bulls. They would breed pit bulls. So she thought, well, maybe their dog had a litter of puppies. She said as soon as she got out of the car and saw Chelsea on the front porch, she knew she was deceased. So she goes up and confronts the suspect's mother and says, "You have to call 911. And an actual argument and physical struggle ensues over the phone and whether or not 911 will be called. Another step that we take is we go pull all 911 calls that come in about any specific incident so that we can listen to them, not only to what the caller's saying, but to see if we can identify anything in the background or any other noises or anything that are going on. And on their 911 call, you can actually hear the argument. You have to talk to them. And the suspect's mother saying, "I'm not talking to anybody. I'm not calling 911. I'm not." And you can actually, it feels like they're fighting over the phone. And then finally you hear her say, "You have to." And then the suspect's mom says, "Hey, there's some girl on our porch. We don't know what's going on." And that was the 911 call. When I first listened to it, I didn't exactly know what I was listening to. Then I interviewed the aunt, went back and listened to it again, and understood exactly what was going on the front end of that 911 call.
So when he approaches the aunt, it's more of a curiosity thing of, "Hey, you've got to see this." That's just bizarre.
It's almost like "Hey, you're not going to believe this." And she said he was just so nonchalant about it and just callous that she thought it was dealing with animals or something else. She had no idea that he was referring to the girl that was on their front porch.
Were the 8 and 11-year-olds, were they hysterical that there's a dead person on their porch?
They seemed to be more in shock than anything else. They were pretty reserved, as far as they just kind of sat still and almost just couldn't believe what was going on. And by the time we get called, like I said, it was 8:00 at night. Till the time we notify the family, get a positive identification. I mean, we're talking about, we're dragging on into Monday morning. I don't think I went home until after lunch on Monday that day. And so when we're interviewing the kids and things like that, we're getting into 11 o'clock at night probably, because we tried to interview the kids as early as we could, so that we didn't have them stay up too late. Because with the adults, you get into midnight or so, it's not as big of a deal. But we wanted to make sure and get those interviews completed and move on to the adults. And the boys initially lied to us as well. They started off by telling us the same story that everybody else tried to tell us. And then when they were confronted, one, by the officers, hey, we know that's a lie. And two, we had their mom in the interview with them, and she told them, hey, they know it's a lie. Tell them the truth. And then they came off of that story and told us pretty close versions. One of the boys describes watching Carlos move her, never describes actually helping her. One of the other brothers describes kind of helping. But according to Carlos's testimony, all three of the boys helped.
Did the boys ever tell you that they were encouraged to tell that story, that they just found her there?
Oh, yeah. And by the time we got around to that part and everybody dropped that story and actually began to tell the truth, they let us know, hey, Carlos is the one that told us to lie. And that was pretty consistent with everybody.
And you mentioned that when you were talking in that interview and you said that was the closest you were going to get. Was that the last interview you had with Carlos? Or?
Yes.
So no other attempt was able to?
No, we got that interview. And like I said, we felt like that was close to the truth, but not the complete truth, especially when you're talking about the consensual sex and the protected sex. We did ask him to write out a statement. In that statement, he gets to the part of having sex and completely skips from there all the way till I woke up the next morning. And so there was a huge time gap in there. And it's not uncommon for people to leave a time gap when something bad happens. And so we felt like he had jumped over everything, and we weren't going to get any further with him by pushing him. We knew we had DNA that, or the swabs that were collected, that we would be sending off. We had gotten a DNA sample from him as well. And so we were just going to wait on those results before we tried to attempt any further interviews or anything else. Getting the DNA results back confirmed that his DNA was present in the victim's body. With all of that, didn't feel like we needed to do another interview.
So after the first interview, was he released, or did you all take him into custody at that point?
No. We brought him in. He never left our custody. So from the time we got to the house, we brought him in. We did an interview and told him he was lying, and we never left the room with him. Said, nope, that's a lie. Try again. And then he's like, okay, well, actually, we had sex and she left. Nope, that's a lie. Try again. And we literally just sat in the room with him, and he gave us 4 different statements in one sitting.
Wow. So he was really trying his best to get away with it. Sounds like
he was trying. I mean, and by this time he had gotten a story together, got his whole entire family to try to lie for him, and had staged the crime scene to match the story that he had put together for the family.
So he gets taken into custody, and I guess now is protocol that the crime scene is now unsecure, or can family members still not return home?
So one of the things that'll happen is while we're doing the interviews, we'll also type a search warrant. Although we have probable cause to be there at the scene where they're working on the immediate scene, we will type a search warrant to search the rest of the house. Just better safe than sorry. It's one less thing you have to fight when you get to court. And honestly, in my opinion, it's just the proper way to go about that process. I like to try to do things the same way every time. That way, if an issue comes up, or if you're ever questioned about it, I know that I did steps 1, 2, and 3, because I always do steps 1, 2, and 3.
Sure.
So,
and those search warrants, I was that same way too, because I used to watch other investigators in different sections play with consent and think that was enough. But facts can change. You could get, for example, written or verbal consent from a subject, or feel like you don't need it, and then go get into a closet and find personal belongings where the expectation of privacy was there. So I'm with you on getting a search warrant. I was the same way. I cut paper every time. It's the safest bet too.
So he's placed in custody after that interview with you, when you finally get the closest version to the truth that you're going to get. Families all released because you've gotten their statements. Now, I guess as a mother, my thought is this Chelsea's poor mom. Did you go speak with her first? Was that your job? And if so, how did that go?
I did. It was myself and 2 other investigators. I was fairly new to the homicide unit at that time. One of the other investigators had been there for a couple of years, and so he kind of led that talk. Initially, we arrived and explained we were with the homicide unit and that we were working on a case of a party who was deceased who matched the description of their daughter. And again, tried to convey the idea that we think it may be her, but we're not absolutely sure that it is her. So we're going to need some more details from you to help us identify her. And from that conversation, we were fairly certain it was in fact Chelsea, but we had them come down to the medical examiner's office and meet us down there so that we could really kind of finalize that identification to say, in fact, yes, this is her, or no, it is not her. And from that, we were able to say, yes, this is in fact her.
And I think what a lot of the audience, I'm sure most people who listen to our podcast are crime enthusiasts, but can you tell as an investigator how different it is than watching First 48 or Forensic Files when you have to look at that victim's mother and tell her that horrible news that she probably knows deep in her soul what you're getting ready to tell her? Tell us how, when you walk away from that and you finally do get to go home after those 20-hour days, how bad did that wear on you?
On a case like that, there's a moment of sitting in the car alone and just trying to kind of collect yourself and gather yourself. When you're dealing with a victim's family, you want to be as professional as possible, but you also want to be empathetic as well. But it's hard because you can't carry that stuff around with you all the time because it will destroy you from the inside out. And so you have to figure out a way to release that stress. Thankfully for me, God has blessed me with an amazing wife. I've been able to talk to her about what I've seen, what I've been through. My father, like I said, he was a police officer. He's since passed away, but at the time I was in homicide, he was still with me, and I was able to talk to him. And I had channels that I could kind of release some of the stress, but it's one of the hardest things you'll ever do. It's bad enough to approach somebody and have to tell them that a loved one has passed away, especially in the context of their life was taken. They were murdered. Somebody took their life. It's a entirely different thing when you have to approach somebody and tell them not only was someone's life taken, but it was a child, and it was your child. Especially having children of my own. There are often times when I think about, like, how would I respond if somebody showed up and told me that one of my children had their life taken? And so I tried to convey my message in such a way that I was very understanding, but that I got the message across, because I didn't want to leave false hope that it's probably not her. Again, our position was, we think this is probably her. We just can't say 100%. In the off chance that it's not her, we want to find out as quickly as possible so that you're not stuck with this burden, of trying to see, is this her, is this not her? We want to kind of get you the news, good or bad, as soon as possible. And it's just a very difficult thing to navigate through.
Along that same line, when you're talking about meeting these people and these family members and bringing them the worst news they would ever find, I always looked at it as you're representing that family in a lot of ways. Did you ever start to feel a relationship or rapport build with those family members that was maybe a little deeper than other people in the community based on that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And there was a different case I had worked, and one of the victims' families came to the viewing of my father when he passed away. And that was probably one of the most special moments in my life as an officer, just knowing they had just seen on the news that my father had passed away. They knew me because of the work I did with their family member's case. And they took it upon themselves to come by the funeral home to see my family, just as a way of saying, thank you, really is what it was. And that really struck me deep down, that I really enjoyed the investigations part of my career, because I felt like I made a difference, not just on the street, taking bad guys off the street, but I made a difference in the victims' families, where they could get closure. They could understand that we did everything we could to bring them that closure and to bring them that justice. And I know it's a crazy time that we live in right now, but I truly believe that if every police officer, not just investigations, every police officer would strive as hard as they could to bring that closure or that justice to every call they went on, that could lessen some of the tensions. Because even if you go to a call where people are not being cooperative, or people may not seem like they appreciate the work of the police, if you gave that 100% effort at that call, just like you did on a call where someone was cooperative or someone did appreciate the police, you could bring the same amount of closure to both groups of people. And to me, that's true equality in treatment. Is when I strive my hardest, no matter what the roadblocks are, to make sure that a family gets justice, especially when you talk about homicides, make sure that family gets justice, whether they cooperate or not. I've worked cases where the victim's family wouldn't necessarily even cooperate with us, but I still owe it to them to do everything I can to come to a resolution in that case.
You make a good point too, as far as building relationships in the community. I was always big on that too. One of my favorite sergeants that I had the pleasure to work with was Sergeant Jodan Famulero, and he used to preach to his squads all the time to treat those calls like the most important call you're going to that day, because for the people that you just arrived, it is. And that would, I've with you 100%, I think that would just take our industry light years at a fast pace into if we could collectively come to that.
Well, and we've talked before, David, not just on podcasts, but over the dinner table at home, how that case, even though I'm sure you, Daniel, had more cases coming in while this was going on with Chelsea, to that family, to that victim's family, that's the most important case. They don't know. Maybe they don't know that you have other cases. They don't realize that it just doesn't stop there. And all the other cases until hers is solved is, appointed to someone else. They're still coming to you and your workload is heavy. But for that victim, that level of compassion and empathy is so important, because to them, the other cases don't matter. That's their victim. And I think also, David, you had talked not just on homicide victims, but David's so compassionate to the homeless victim, or the homeless people in the community, or people that have mental handicaps. He's always so compassionate. And when he was still with the police department, he always would tell how you have to offer that compassion and that respect to those people, even though they are homeless, or even though maybe they are mentally challenged and would fight you in an instant. And I just hope that the generation that's doing this now, since David, you're retired, but I hope at least, sounds like you and I hope the rest of your guys extend that to the people out in the community, because not everybody's going to be likable. It's such a sweet gesture that you put aside their feelings for you, and you're still doing that job 110%.
So speaking of these things, I'm going to bring it back to this case that we're talking about. A year prior to this event, I was a patrol officer, and I gave Carlos a ride home to this very house because he was the passenger in a stolen car where I arrested the driver and got a gun off the driver. And he was 17 at the time, and he was a backseat passenger. So I gave him a ride home and dropped him off at the very house where a year later I would come work this homicide.
When you pulled up, did you remember that instantly?
No, actually it was when I saw him is when I remembered it. So when I first pulled up, I didn't really remember it. But then when I saw him, I was like, wait a minute. And then it was kind of like, I remember, because I never got out of the car. I just pulled up, jumped out, opened the back door. It's like, wait, I remember giving him a ride home. It's like, come to think, this was the location I brought him to. A year after this event, I'm walking through the police department. I had gotten promoted I take it back. It was probably 2 years after. I had gotten promoted to sergeant and got moved out. So in our structure, investigators are not equal to sergeants, and a lot of other departments they are. I got promoted to sergeant and got moved out, and I got put on midnight shift. I'm walking through the main squad room in the department, and I see Carlos's mother in the main squad room sitting down on one of our couches, and I call her name, and she turns around and she sees me, and she jumps up and she yells Francis, and she runs over and gives me a hug. And I thought, well, I mean, by this point, he had already pled guilty to the homicide. So he pled guilty to, they ended up pleading guilty to second-degree murder and aggravated rape because the family didn't want to go through the trauma of a trial. So he had already been sentenced, knew he was in jail for 25 plus years. I'm thinking to myself, I just put one of your kids in jail for the good part of the rest of their life, and here you are giving me a hug. And I start talking to her, and the two 11-year-olds are now 13, and they had robbed somebody with a BB gun. So I talked to the investigator and asked him, can I talk to the boys? I won't talk about the case, anything like that. And he says, yeah, absolutely. So I pull him into my office for the patrol division, and I talk to him and basically come to an agreement that if they will attempt to do something they're interested in, one of them was interested in football, another one was interested in basketball. So my thing was, you have to attempt to make the team. You can't necessarily control whether you make the team or not. You can control your effort in trying to do that. So try to make the team, keep up your grades, and don't get arrested again. A year from now, I will take you to an NBA game on my dime. And I actually wrote it out on paper and signed it and gave them a copy of it. And I stayed in contact with them for the next year. The day before we were supposed to go down to the NBA game, one of the boys got arrested for truancy. And I explained to his mom, and I explained to him, it's not that I don't love you. It's not that I don't care about you, but you cannot go on this trip with us because we had standards in place. And I actually took his younger brother in his place. And I had a good friend of mine who had grown up in gangs, who had gotten completely out of that lifestyle, was now married, had kids, and was actually a youth pastor at my church. I took him with me, and we went down and we took the boys down. And I did part of that because I recognized that what they were going through was a result of what they had been through. So part of the decisions they were making stem back from the trauma. That's not an excuse to do wrong, but it is an explanation for why they're doing wrong. And I wanted to have some level of positive influence in their lives to see if we could kind of stem that tide and change that direction. So I have stayed involved even with the suspect's family from the time that this case has moved on.
It's a fantastic point, because a lot of, again, people from the outside don't see this, but that victimization is a snowball, and it hits both sides of the fence, if you will. Because I remember meeting with so many parents of suspects and watching their hearts get broken, and they love their kids, or they love their brother or sister, whoever it was, and they are suffering through this loss, not to the degree of somebody lost somebody, but their lives are destroyed. There's a lot of trust that's been broken. They know that this loved one's life is never going to be the same. And again, inside those families, I think we're starting to recognize more and more that trauma ripples out inside of a family like that. And intervention is probably the next key on that, is to look at it and say, we know that there's been a traumatic event inside the family. We need to get resources in there as soon as possible. Fantastic work. Fantastic.
So back to Miss Chelsea and her mother. What happens at this point? You know, like I said a few minutes ago, I can't imagine her. Number one, her heart's just been ripped out, but the confusion, because she just thought her daughter was in bed. Not only is it a shock losing your child, but she's just probably so confused as to how last night she was there. And now not only is she not there because the baby's crying, but now somebody's telling me that she's a victim. I can't imagine the level of confusion that lady must have been feeling. What ends up happening with her at that? How do you all offer support to her family? On
our end, that's one of the most difficult things I think about the investigation process is I can offer the how in this case. I know I can trace from the time she left her house, who came and picked her up, how she met Carlos, how she got back to his house, even to a degree how she was killed. I can't necessarily offer the why. And so the family may be left with wondering why, even after on our end, the case is closed. In the state of Tennessee, we do have victim services that are offered through the courts. And so once he's charged, the Chattanooga Police Department now has a victim advocacy wing. And so we do a lot more of that in-house. At the time, when I was in homicide, they would be passed off to the court system. And then the district attorney's office had a victim advocacy component. And then they were offered services, whether it's counseling or assistance, whatever they needed through that office in particular. And then you have the court case you still have to go through. And in Tennessee, the way our system works is if someone's charged, like we charged Carlos before he left the police department, we go take out warrants, patrol takes him down to the jail, the warrants are served, he'll be scheduled for a general sessions hearing. All that hearing does is establishes whether there's probable cause or not to uphold the charges he's been charged with. From there, a bond can be set, and then it'll go to grand jury. The grand jury will hear the case. They'll either true bill it or no bill it. In this case, they true bill it, so then it gets sent to state court. At that point, the negotiations began taking place. You have discovery hearings. If there's suppression hearings, all of that stuff takes place during that process, and then it goes to trial. In this case, we went through the discovery hearings, which led to the plea deal. Now, because the evidence, DNA evidence is pretty solid evidence. So with that being there was just no way around his involvement in her homicide. So they chose to take the plea deal, and the family wasn't in agreement with that because they didn't want to have to go through all the trauma of hearing everything in open court. And at that point, you're getting into showing photos of injuries and things like that. And so the family just felt that it would be best to allow the plea deal and to go from there.
Let me ask you this. In Tennessee, is that a death penalty state? Is it still available here?
Yes, it's still available. And this case does meet the criteria for that. Again, though, the family just opted not to go through that. And that may have been one of the mitigating factors in accepting a plea deal as well, is taking that portion off the table.
That's what I thought probably happens. I know back home that's a big deal. And that's the power of that potential penalty sometimes, as it moves the system along a little quicker. So that's interesting. Was he the only one charged in the case, or?
Yeah, as far as we can tell from all of the testimony and even from his testimony, they went into his bedroom together and were last seen together alone. And then when people began to wake up, she was dead in his bedroom. And that's one of the things we pushed him on during his interview is it even possible that somebody else could have done something or had come in your room, and he just said, no, absolutely not even possible.
During that trial, when he received his sentencing, did he keep sticking to the same story that the last one he gave you, or did he ever give more detail about putting those physical injuries on her?
No, that was the last statement that he made about the case.
When he pled, did he have to make any statements? Did the judge require any detail or anything like that? What ended up being his sentence?
He got 25 years. Because they ended up pleading to second-degree homicide and the aggravated rape charges. So he's on the sexual offenders registry and 25 years to serve.
Is that a true calendar 25? Or because in Kentucky, a lot of people don't know, like the average life sentence is 7. It shocks people. It's one of those things I think needs to be improved upon. But does he have a pro eligibility before that 25, do you think?
Oftentimes in Tennessee, there is eligibility at around 30 to 50% of sentence served. So I recently looked it up, and he is still in custody. And, we're coming up on 8.5 years after the event.
Daniel, that fantastic detail on the case. And more importantly, I think what I'm appreciative is interpersonal level that you took it to, because again, one of our goals in our podcast is to let listeners who are interested in this line of work understand the personal aspect of it, because TV and Hollywood puts a different cast on this, and most of the time it's not even accurate. And a couple TV shows get close, but everybody still misses that ball, so thanks for doing that. This case didn't go to trial and probably was pled for all the right reasons. I would argue and agree with that completely. But had it gone to trial, can you tell the audience what it's like to testify in one of these high-level cases where everything in balance means so much? You talked about being an advocate for victims' families and the trust that comes and the rapport it builds, which is a huge responsibility. What's it like to testify in a case like this, and what do you bring to that? How do you approach it? What do you do to make it easier on yourself? Just tell the audience a little bit about some of that.
For starters, not every case plays out the same way. So in this case, it was pled with a plea deal of guilty. Other cases, as it works its way through the trial system, you have that general sessions where there's a brief testimony. Then there's grand jury where evidence is presented. A lot of times that's just reading directly from the case file. You're not cross-examined or anything like that. Then when you move into that next stage where you have suppression hearings and discoveries, there may be 2 or 3 different times when you're called to testify in connection to the case leading up to the actual trial. And different victims' families approach things differently. Some victims' families want to be there for every single court appearance and every single hearing. Other families only want to be there for the main trial. So you weave and wind your way through all of that, and you get to the actual trial. Preparing for the trial, I normally spend several days reading over my case file, just refreshing myself, my memory on what happened, when it happened, how things played out during the investigation. Because when you get up there on the stand, for me, it's intensely nerve-wracking because I do take our court systems very seriously. It may not be absolutely perfect, but it's the best system that's been put forth to date. And with that, when I stand up there and I swear that I'm going to tell the truth, I take that very seriously. And when you get up there, you get sworn in and you start laying out the case, you would have already had a meeting with the prosecution and they kind of give you an idea of where they're trying to go with the case and kind of guide as far as the elements of events for your testimony. And they have some questions they'll answer you, and you'll go through all of their list of questions and answer those in relation to the evidence that you had. One of the things that really helped me out with that was I took a 1-day class on courtroom testimony, and it changed my perception of my role in the courtroom. And that is, I am not for the prosecution or against the defense attorney. I simply am the state's representative and the collection point of the evidence. And so I'm just representing the evidence of the story that unfolded. And that's what I'm there to do, is I'm there to lay that out. It's the prosecutor's job to lay that out in such a way that he gains a conviction, or the defense attorney's job to defend that in such a way that they get an acquittal. I'm simply just there to explain the evidence, how it was collected, how the timeline we're able to put together comes out. So as you go through that, you may be on the stand for several hours. Me personally, thankfully, I have an ability to remember things. And so I've been on the stand several times for several hours at a time. I bring a copy of my case file with me, but I personally don't have to look at my case file or reference it. I've reviewed it leading up to that. Generally, memory serves me pretty well, and I'm able to answer questions and go through details without having to look up different things. I know there are some people that may have to refer to their case notes or look up specific things because there can be so many details involved. In the state of Tennessee, as the lead detective, you can actually represent the entire case. And so you can represent what other investigators learned in interviews or collected. And those details in particular can get lost sometimes if you're asked about them on the stand. And that's the reason some officers have to kind of look through things, is if you're asking me about what somebody else did, that can become very hard to try to answer without, referring to their work and what they did.
So I guess, does that make it less intimidating? To be able to have a mindset and a heart set when you come and take the oath and sit down? Has it helped you with that?
I think it's still intimidating, especially the first time. The first time is one of the hardest times, because to be honest with you, even as a patrol officer, you don't testify that much, even at the general sessions level. When you get into that courtroom setting where there's a jury that's actually seated, there's an audience, there's the judge, the prosecution, the defendant, the defense attorneys. It's a lot of pressure. As you do that 2 or 3 times, the fact that you're there isn't as much pressure, but the fact that this is a very serious proceeding, that pressure remains no matter how many times you do it.
Gotcha. And you talked about doing it a few times and getting more adjusted to it. Did you ever get a sense that some of the defense attorneys, at least the ones that worked in your community frequently, did they start to recognize your capabilities? Did you build a rapport with them that was more professional, do you think? Because I think that's a result of that too. And was that an experience of yours?
Absolutely. One in particular comes to mind where he and I had a conversation, and he told me, he said, when I see your name on a case, I know it's either completely rock solid or it's just probable cause because, basically you were told to fill out paperwork. He's like, but when I see your name on a case, he said, there's no question about it. He said, immediately I start thinking we should probably take a plea deal.
Doesn't sound like TV and movies, does it?
No, it's not at all. And to be honest, you can't go into the courtroom and take those things personally, even to the degree, if your evidence is not solid, the defense attorney will attack your evidence. They'll attack your case. Remember, their goal is to defend their client. If your evidence is rock solid, it's fairly common for them to begin to attack you or attack things around the case, because how I respond to that, the jury begins to look at me and they may or may not have questions about my work ethic or how I do things or why I did them based on how I'm responding to somebody attacking me right there in open court. And so it's just one of the ways to kind of go, oh, well, the case is solid, but maybe we can cause doubt in the officer's work or the investigator's work if we go directly at them. And it's not a personal thing. I've had that happen before, and the defense attorney, I know them. I know they're doing their job, or at least trying to do their job for their client. And you just have to be able to walk out of there and understand that what happens isn't personal on the investigation side. And it's not personal, me against the defendant either. I simply responded to a call, collected evidence, presented that evidence to the court system. It's the jury's decision at the jury trial whether they're innocent or guilty. And then if they're found guilty, it's the judge's decision. And he has guidelines he has to follow, but it's the judge's decision what the punishment for that is. So I can't walk out of there and hang my head if somebody's found innocent. That was the jury's call. I can't walk out of there and hang my head if he's not given as long a sentence as I think he should be. That's the judge's call. My piece of the puzzle is simply to testify to the evidence that's being presented.
What a great Well, thank you very much for having us. And I know it was a fun road trip. We hadn't been to Chattanooga in a while, so it was great. And thanks to the Chattanooga Police Department, because I've met a handful of people from down here, and you all are in great shape for a city. It's a fantastic PD, and you can tell by the quality of your work and your passion for that is I've got all the faith in the world to them. Wendy, is there anything you wanted to add?
No, I just wanted to, I guess, kind of piggyback on what you said, and thank you, Daniel, for the tireless work that you put into this case on Chelsea Hayes. And, again, it's nice that you dug in and told about how those emotions come into play, because I think oftentimes people don't realize how you all may wear this on your sleeve and try your best to put on that cape tomorrow and go back to work like it doesn't bother you. And it's one of those jobs that at the end of the day, it truly just doesn't end because you're not at work right now. So thank you for all that you do. And thank you so much for taking time away from your wife and children to spend with us to talk about this case, and keep doing the great job you're doing. It's people like you that the communities really, really need.
Well, thank you very much for having me on. I had a great time being here with you and sharing with you.
The Murder Police podcast is hosted by Wendy and David Lyons and was created to honor the lives of crime victims so their names are never forgotten. This podcast is produced, recorded, and edited by David Lyons. The Murder Police podcast can be found on your favorite Apple or Android podcast platform, as well as at murderpolicepodcast.com, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you have enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe for more and give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcast or wherever you download your podcast from. And please tell your friends. Lock it down, Judy.